All right. Well, we've got a large group and a lot of content, so I'm going to go ahead and jump in. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat tool. And then we also will have some time at the end of the presentation where we're happy to open it up for anybody to unmute and ask questions live. But we'll go ahead and get started. So just for anybody who's not already familiar with Paragus IT, I'll provide us a kind of a quick introduction. We are a 65-person employee-owned IT services company, and our kind of passion and purpose is to help make IT work for small businesses. And so as part of that commitment, we've run this webinar series where we take different topics that we believe will be of interest to our community and share our thoughts and ideas around what we hope is some helpful information that will help guide and lead our clients and our prospective clients and just our general community members. So, as I always like to do, let's start off with just some context of kind of why we're here. Data is the foundation of your business. Not only do you want to be able to work from anywhere, anytime, but you want to remain competitive. And tools like old school VPNs are really struggling to keep up with modern technology. Not only that, but AI and automation is much easier when your data is in a single cloud repository. With a strong preference towards Microsoft, most importantly in 2025, data is everything. It's one of your organization's most valuable assets. It's the one thing you have that a brand new startup doesn't have, and it's going to be essential to you being able to create and train smart AI that is ultimately going to help your business succeed in the future. So, with all of that said, we agree data is vital. It's vital for us to be able to work. It's vital for our business to be able to thrive. It's the information that we use to collaborate and share. And now, what's really important is where does that data live? Where are we hosting it? How are we managing it? How are we controlling it? How are we securing it? With all of that information, the point of today's webinar is to look at SharePoint. Now, SharePoint has gotten a little bit of a bad rap over the years, and some businesses have avoided it. Our goal for today is to talk about what SharePoint looks like in 2025, what it can do for your business, what it can't do, and why we believe that, at least for most organizations, it is the right platform for them to host the majority of their data. Today, our data lives in lots of places, a lot more than it used to. We have our data on proprietary third-party applications. Think about things like maybe QuickBooks, or maybe you have an online EMR or EHR or ERP system. We have data on our computers, our laptops, and our desktops. Even when we're not supposed to be storing data there, many of us do. We may still have data on local servers or SANs or NASs or other kind of physical hardware that we own that is in an office or a data center. We also have data in various online cloud platforms. Think about things like Box, OneDrive, Dropbox, etc. The challenge that we really have today is just how many places our data lives. Why is that such a challenge? For a number of reasons. First, especially from an IT standpoint, it presents a huge security challenge. When your data lives in lots and lots of places, it's very difficult for us or anyone to really make sure that that data is properly being secured, because each of those data platforms typically has a different username and password, different set of users, different set of permissions, different set of authentication protocols, different file structure. And all of that complexity just leads to opportunities for data to be leaked, either intentionally or unintentionally, through something like a hacker getting in. Then there's the management side, being able to just keep track of all that data, keep it up to date, reference things that are no longer need to be referenced, being able to archive things, knowing who has what data when and where that data lives, being able to onboard new employees and help them navigate and understand where all that data lives. It gets quite challenging. Then there's the compliance side. More and more states, industries, and now even the federal government is looking at data compliance rules, regulations, and laws. This means that we have to have very strict rules about who can access what data, whether we're tracking access to that data, whether we have logs or reports that show who accessed what data when. There's more and more compliance restrictions, and some of those platforms don't even support compliance. But even the ones that do, if we have to track those in 5 or 6 different places, it makes the entire process very complicated. Another major challenge that we need to pay attention to is DLP, or data loss prevention. And data loss can happen in lots of different ways. You could have DLP from accidentally deleting data, not realizing it's not backed up, or not even realizing where that data lives. You could have DLP because an employee is maliciously trying to take data off the system. You could have DLP because somebody has stolen data from you and deleted it from your network. But we're always trying to make sure that we're preserving data, not only for the organization's benefit, but in a lot of cases for compliance reasons as well. Then there's business continuity. If your data is in 12, 15, 20 different places, it becomes that much more complicated and expensive to make sure that you have a comprehensive business continuity plan that is going to make sure that if something happens, the organization continues to have access to the information it needs to be able to function and thrive. It also makes collaboration and sharing really difficult. If I'm keeping data in Google Drive and you're keeping it in OneDrive and you're sending me links and I'm sending you links and I'm constantly looking through my email to find the link to the data that I'm trying to access, and then I've got some data in my email that's being sent to me directly as an attachment, and then I'm sometimes going to Dropbox and logging in, it just gets really complicated for us to all collaborate and share on the same tools. And some of these tools make collaboration and sharing very difficult. They're just not designed for it. And then finally, data ownership becomes a real challenge. If you have a distributed workforce or a workforce that is working hybrid in a remote environment and they've got data on their local laptop and they leave and you don't get that laptop back, it's very hard to retain control and ownership of that data to make sure that the organization is not losing any of its intellectual property, which may live on individual devices or even in individual cloud accounts. We very frequently will run into customers where an employee has set up a Google Drive account on their own and they're storing their data in there because they happen to like Google Drive better than another platform. But if that employee leaves, that data often goes with them because nobody else knows how to get into that Google Drive account or to access that data or to copy it out. And so there's a lot of challenges with how dispersed we've allowed our data to become. But the thing that we're really focused on right now, and we alluded to this in our last webinar, is your data is one of your most valuable assets. And we say that because your data, especially if you have a lot of it and it's good proprietary rich data, it's going to allow you to do things with AI that other organizations won't be able to do. Things that are very, very specific to your customers, your business, your environment. And getting that data right is really, really critical. Here's the challenge. When your data lives in a lot of different places, it's really hard to train AI on that data. The more structured, the more centralized, the more organized your data is, the better that we're able to help organizations leverage tools like AI to use that data to either create really rich bots, to be able to answer questions, or even just to make it easier for your employees to find what they're looking for quickly without having to navigate a complex system of data ownership. Now, there's a lot of you on this call. I would not be surprised at all if some of you are still storing your data on something that looks like this. In my mind, this is the lowest hanging fruit. This is the hardest for a customer to defend that this is still a good place to store data. Of all the places we could have arguments and discussions and rich, robust debates about where data should live, this is probably the hardest one to defend in 2025. And why is that? Because file servers are the equivalent of yellow pages. They really have come and gone. They had their era. That era has passed. It is no longer a defensible place to store data. And there's a number of reasons. We'll fly through them. So first, let's talk about email. 5, 10 years ago, there's probably many of you on this call who would have had your email on a local server in your building, probably something like a Microsoft Exchange server. And you were storing your email there and it was distributed out to all the computers and it was relatively centralized. And 10 years ago, that made sense. That was the common way that it was done. However, I'd be shocked if anybody on this call today is still storing their email on premise. I imagine almost all of you, if not every single one of you, has moved your email to something like Microsoft 365, maybe Google Workspace, or some other online cloud platform. And why did you do that? You did it because it's much more reliable, it's much more secure, it's accessible easily from any device, anytime, and it's more cost effective. You can't tell me that if something is all four of those things, it's not the right decision. So what I'm trying to make sure that you're clear about is all four of those same benefits apply to moving your data to a tool like SharePoint. But there's a lot more than just those four. So we'll start for those of you who still have local data you're storing on a file server, a NAS, or a SAN. This message is still familiar to you. For those of you who have moved off of those systems, you remember this message, but you don't have to deal with it anymore. And this is the idea that a file can only be edited by one person at a time. Something that as soon as you move your data to a cloud provider like a SharePoint tool, you get rid of that restriction. And suddenly you can use your data from anywhere, anytime, multiple people can be in the file at the same time, and you get to have that kind of collaboration. What if I told you that forgetting to hit save as could be corrected with 2 clicks of the mouse, zero panic, and no phone call to IT? So how is that possible? When you move your data to an online platform, you get access to incredible revision history or version history. So this allows you to say, oh, I just made a bunch of changes. I meant to hit save as because I didn't want to overwrite the original. No problem. All I have to do is open up a previous version of the file, hit file, save as, and now I have both copies, the original version and the one that I meant to save as something else. No issue. I don't need to involve IT. I can do it entirely on my own with just a couple of clicks of the mouse. And that's called revision history. Microsoft SharePoint can go up to 250 versions of any single file with no retention period. In other words, an infinite amount of retention. So I can have 250 versions going back years of a file that maybe I'm editing all the time. And maybe at some point in time, I'm like, you know what? I don't recognize this change. When did that change happen? Not only can I go back and see the revision history, I can see who made that change. In this case, I can see Tony Redmond made the change on this date, on this at this time. I can go back, open up the version before the change was made, restore that. It just makes life a lot easier. Still not convinced? I am sure some of us on this call, probably everyone, at some point in time meant to hit save, but instead hit didn't save and lost hours and hours of work they had done on some file they were working on. In online platforms, again, especially in SharePoint, which is what we're focused on today, you have an auto-save technology that's built into every document that you're working on. So every time you're working on a document, create a document, open up a document, every few minutes, it's saving that revision history for you in the background. So you can just simply close out of a document. You don't ever have to think about saving anymore. Saving is just something that happens naturally in the background, as it would with many other web-based applications. And again, you can then go back not only to the most recent version, but many revisions beyond that. So the reality is I could probably give you another 100 reasons why your files should not live on an old legacy file server. However, rather than just spend the next 30 minutes looking at funny memes, let's dig in a little deeper into the major benefits and the mechanics of SharePoint. But before we do that, I do want to spend a minute addressing the elephant in the room, which is the fact that many of us have heard negative things about SharePoint that are still lasting thoughts that prevent businesses from doing that migration. So these are kind of some of the things that we've heard clients bring up to us. I'm sure some of you have heard them. I can never find anything. It's too confusing. SharePoint is slow. It's struggling. I just hate SharePoint. These kind of generic statements. And for those of you who haven't heard these, there was a general, fairly well understood consensus for many, many years that SharePoint did suck, one that we agreed with. In fact, it was an opinion that we would regularly share with clients that it wasn't the right platform for many organizations for many, many years. But we got to go back in time a little bit to understand where that came from and where we're at today. SharePoint has been around for a very long time. It started out as SharePoint portal server in 2001, and it was designed to be a company's like intranet page. From there, Microsoft kept introducing new versions and upgrades, but the reality was that it was too complicated, it was too hard to manage, it wasn't user-friendly, and beyond that, it was quirky as hell, and it required a lot of support and people who really understood how it worked. However, that's not the SharePoint that we're talking about today. This was predominantly an on-premise version of SharePoint that lived on a server somewhere in your building. And the thought process was that you would access the files directly through that SharePoint interface, through that web page. Very few businesses ever really truly adopted that model. It was very challenging and it had a lot of faults. That's not what we're talking about for the rest of today. What we're talking about is SharePoint based in 365 and for the most part, largely accessed through other systems. And I'll show you in a little bit later what type of systems we use as the front end for SharePoint, in addition to accessing that data through the SharePoint Online interface. So what we're talking about is SharePoint Online. And one of the key components of Office 365 is SharePoint Online. It's an essential building block in your 365 foundation. So beyond the reasons we've already covered, let's dig into some of the deeper additional benefits of SharePoint Online specifically. So first, since SharePoint Online is web-based and hosted in Microsoft's cloud, there's nothing extra to manage. You don't have a piece of hardware that you have to buy, that you have to replace, that you have to worry about getting unplugged, that you have to worry about somebody forgetting to back up. It's not a device in your office anymore. And so very much like getting rid of the headache of email sitting on a server, that if that server was down, we couldn't send email, we couldn't get email. We no longer have to worry about if this server's down, we can't access our files. If this server was to get unplugged or we lost power, or a hacker was to somehow get into there and encrypt all of our data, we'd lose everything. We'd lose access to our ability to do our jobs. That all goes away. And the thing is, for many of you, you're already paying for Microsoft 365 licensing. And in most cases, SharePoint is already part of that licensing. So not only are you giving up one cost, but in most cases, you're not gaining another cost to offset that. For most of you, this is just a net savings. You're getting rid of a physical piece of hardware or other subscription or something else that you're paying for to host that data that is going to go away. And there's probably not going to be a huge incremental cost to add in SharePoint. And for many of you, there'll be zero cost because it's already built into licensing you're paying for. Multifunctionality, and we've talked about this a little bit a second ago, but file storage and collaboration platform among staff, making it really easy to share documents, collaborate, leave comments, and we'll look into that more in a second. If you want to, having an internal website where you can update company information, have announcements, have staff calendars, do some of those things. And again, not a requirement, but it is still a feature if you want to take advantage of that. You can easily share content with outside parties like your vendors or your customers. So think of SharePoint as a platform in which you can have data just for you, data for teams, data for your company, but then also starting to expand that umbrella to have data that's maybe available to your board of directors, or data that's available to a customer or to a group of customers or to vendors that you're working with. And you can build different SharePoint libraries or sites that are accessible by different groups of people and make it very easy to organize and share that data. And then because your data is locally centralized in the SharePoint Online platform, you then have the ability to build really impressive automations and AI that leverages that data to do things like answer questions, provide you with useful feedback, provide you with analysis, or handle even requests that are coming from customers or employees directly by interacting with that data that you have now centralized into a secure platform. Now, since SharePoint Online is cloud-based, it does mean that you can access it from anywhere on any device. And we'll talk about in a minute the different types of ways that you can access it. But there's accessing it directly through the SharePoint Online interface. And here you can see what that looks like on a mobile device, on a tablet, or on a laptop. But there's a lot of other ways you can access SharePoint. In fact, for most businesses, they access SharePoint almost exclusively through Microsoft Teams. Teams ends up being the front end to their SharePoint interface, and they access all the data through the Teams app, and they never actually go to the SharePoint website. And you have that ability, but you also have the flexibility to be able to do either one or both or all. On the security and compliance side, we can use the strongest form of multi-factor authentication, which is Microsoft's passkey technology. That allows us to have really, really secure, rigid access into that system. We can then back that up with something like our Huntress offering, where we're monitoring every single time an authentication request comes in. We're scoring that authentication request. We're making sure that we know the person authenticating is actually who they say they are. We're looking to see our two different people logging in from two different IP addresses using the same username and password at the same time, all the different types of things that really truly allow us to make sure this data is only being accessed by the people who are supposed to be accessing it. We also then have the ability to do very rich logging of which files were accessed by whom. We can even create alerts based on this. So if you had a particular file in your system that you wanted a text message or a push notification to your phone every time somebody opened up a specific spreadsheet, you could easily do that. If you wanted to be able to go back and see a log of anybody who's ever touched a file or a folder, you can do that. And sometimes businesses do this because the data is highly proprietary, or they're just curious about who's accessing it. And sometimes it's a compliance requirement where they're actually required to keep logs of who's accessing what information on what time, especially if that data is highly confidential, like patient information, financial information, the kind of data that you want to make sure that you have really tight controls around. You also can do restrictions on things like who can print, who can download. There's a lot of different ways you can secure that data. So maybe you can view it, but you can't take it out of the platform or out of the system very easily, making it harder for people to take data outside of your network. It also gives the ability to remove data from people's devices. So if you've allowed somebody to sync data to their phone, but then that employee is no longer with you, we can go back and delete that data from that phone, that laptop, that tablet, whatever that device may be. And it gives you much more control and ownership of your data. It's your data. You might be temporarily lending it to somebody's device, but you also can pull that data back when you need to. And then finally, and this is very popular, you don't need to involve us when you want to make changes to who has access to what. One of the great features of this is it puts the control back into the hands of the client to decide who has access to what data when, and in a very easy, simplistic way that makes it very convenient for customers to self-regulate and manage permissions on data. Okay, but what about the user experience? What we hear all the time is that our users hate change. They're so used to accessing a shared file or a shared folder or a map network drive, or they're so used to using this platform that they're not going to be able to make that change. We're going to have a really hard time getting them over the hump. So this is how a lot of us have accessed files for many, many, many years. You open up the Windows File Explorer or your Mac File Explorer, and then from there, you have your drives. You click on your drives, your files and folders are there. You've got everything from your desktop and your documents to also things like company shared drives, like in this case, the accounting drive. You can set up SharePoint to work almost exactly the same way if that's the experience that you would like. So in this particular case, just over here at my navigation menu, I can have OneDrive, which is the data that is accessible only to me. And that's going to include backing up my desktop, my documents, and my pictures to my OneDrive account so that as I store data locally on my computer, which I'm inevitably going to do, it's still being backed up to the cloud, and the company still has control over that data and can still wipe it, manage it, take ownership of it, audit it, etc. But then I've got right underneath that the name of my company and any documents that are being shared with me that way. So if you have a user who's just really married to the Windows or Apple file experience, and they don't want to access data through a SharePoint Online website, or they don't want to open it up Microsoft Teams, they can literally just access the data in a way that's going to feel incredibly familiar to them without a lot of resistance in terms of introducing something new to them. Now, others are going to be able to access their data through Teams. The way that works, if you're not super familiar with Teams, is you have Teams over here, and then on the Teams, you have a Files tab. If you click on the Files tab, you're going to see files that are associated with that team. What's really great about this is it makes it super convenient and easy to organize data by permission group. So think of team as a group of people who should share access to a set of files. You could have an accounting team. You could have a customer success team. You could have an engineering team, and you can have as many teams as you want. Then within those teams, you can have folders, and within those folders, you can put data. The back end of this is SharePoint. You're organizing it all in teams. You're adding people, removing people to teams. You're talking to people in teams. You're living in teams. But the back end of all of the file and folder structure is actually a Microsoft SharePoint. So this is a very common way that a lot of customers are interacting with SharePoint Online, is just through the Teams interface. And then others can actually go to the SharePoint website itself, where you can open up the SharePoint website, you can see documents, you could download them if you have permission to do so, you can add documents, you can open documents, you can create files and folders, etc. And then some people want to use what's called the Sharepoint app, and that Sharepoint app is available for any mobile device, any tablet, any iPhone, any Android. And from the app, you can have the kind of sites that you access most often. You can see the documents. It'll organize things based on what you've opened up recently. It'll tell you who your colleagues, what documents they're using at any given time. It'll give you a lot of insights and information about how you might want to access data and try to make that as easy for you as possible. And one of the great things about any three of these things, the SharePoint Online, the File Explorer, or the SharePoint app, is if there's data that you're going to need available to you offline, you can simply take a version of that, sync it to your computer, use it on your computer, and then once you have an internet connection again, it'll sync the changes back up to the cloud. That way, if you're getting on an airplane or you're going somewhere that doesn't have internet, you can take data offline, work on that data, and then bring it back online when, again, you're connected to the online world. And that's the beauty of it. You can access your data anytime, anywhere, from any device. In fact, the majority of the users won't just access the data one way. They'll probably use some combination of those available tools based on what they're doing at any given time, the type of file and folder they're accessing. And regardless of how they access it, they can all access the same files at the same time, easily being able to see who else is in the document. So if I'm editing a document, I can see automatically who's in here in real time. I can see where their cursors are, what changes they're making. We can collaborate real time in the document. I can ask questions of each other, and we literally can be kind of collaborating on the same file in the same moment. If I'm not in the file at the same time as somebody else, but I want to leave them comments or notes, I can simply hit the comment button. I can say, hey, please confirm this is the correct URL. I can ask things to be changed or edited. I can suggest that there's a revision that's needed. I can ask a question. I can even assign somebody a to-do to come back and open up a document and make an edit for me. I can do that all just from the comments tab on the right-hand side of any of the Microsoft 365 applications, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, etc. So with all of that in mind, it isn't hard to imagine why this product is growing so quickly in popularity. It's gone from just 13 million users in 2019 all the way up to 200 million users as of 2024. All right. So assuming that you agree, SharePoint makes a lot of sense when compared to having an on-premise server. What about how SharePoint compares to other cloud data providers? The three that we encounter the most often are Box, Google Drive, and Dropbox. So let's start with the seamless Microsoft 365 integration. If your company already uses Microsoft 365, SharePoint isn't just an option, it's the smart choice. What you're doing is you're unlocking the power of what you've already paid for, and you're making it so much easier for all of the other applications to work together. If you're using Microsoft Teams as your communication platform or your phone system or both, putting your data there just makes it so much easier for everybody to collaborate and communicate. If you're already using the Microsoft suite of applications, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, etc., it makes it so much easier to also store that data in OneDrive and SharePoint because it integrates seamlessly into it. And if you're trying to build advanced AI automations or AI bots, having that data in that platform that you're going to be building those bots, again, just makes the whole process much, much easier. It also allows it just to make it more effortless for you to collaborate with each other because we're using one set of permissions, one set of access. Microsoft already knows everybody's name because they have a Microsoft 365 license. I can simply @ somebody, tell them I want them to look at something. It just makes the collaboration and communication so much easier. And the permissions are already syncing with our 365 user groups. So if I already have 365 and I've got my sales team, my engineering team, my customer support team, who's ever in those teams can be the permission groups that I use to share files. Now I'm not also trying to keep track of, okay, in Google Drive, this folder is accessible by these three people, so don't put the HR data there. If you have to put HR data, put it here or email them directly. It gets rid of all that noise. You basically just have teams in Microsoft Teams, which are your groups of different users who have different access to documents. And then you just share the documents with them via those teams. And it simplifies the whole management of permissions and access. And it reduces greatly the chances of somebody leaking data or data getting forgotten because we forgot to disable somebody's account in Box. 2 years after they left and that a password was compromised. The next is that it's built for customization and collaboration. Box, Google Drive, and Dropbox are designed to store files. SharePoint stores knowledge and builds processes. It isn't just cloud storage, it's collaboration and it's a workflow engine. You can build custom lists, you can build what are called libraries, you can build those intranet portals, you can build approval workflows, you can build notifications and alerts and documents. There's so much more to it than just storing the data. There's a lot of automation and other tools that are built into that platform. For example, let's say you need a custom dashboard for HR, or you want a project tracker for engineering. SharePoint's going to be able to do both natively without having to buy third-party add-ons or sign up for other subscriptions and then try to sync the data. And now your data is in another place because now you've got it in Monday.com and Google Drive, and the two of them are syncing, but you're opening it up in Word, which is a third platform. It gets rid of all of that complexity. You also, as we've talked about, are going to get enterprise grade security and compliance. With SharePoint, you're not just securing documents, you're aligning your storage with your enterprise grade risk management. So it leverages tools like Microsoft Purview, Defender, and Entra for world-class protection. You can have alerts that go off if it detects signs of sexual harassment or embezzlement or fraud. You can have different policies where attachments are automatically inspected to make sure that they don't contain any PI or PHI. All kinds of interesting things to make sure your data stays safe. You get very granular control over access, retention policies, your DLP practices, and many more. And you're going to be compliant with HIPAA, with SOC 2, with ISO, with CMMC, with ITAR, and many more. We have not yet found a platform that Microsoft SharePoint is not able to be in compliance with. Some of them do require a different version of 365. For example, there's something called 365 High and 365 GCC. Those are tools that are specifically for certain compliance organizations, but they allow you to have all your data in SharePoint and still be compliant by making sure that data doesn't leave the continental United States and that it's on dedicated servers. And then you get smart data management and search. Think of it as Google Drive with a brain and a memory. You get built-in meta tagging, versioning, and intelligent search using the Microsoft Search and AI tool. This means you can search for something like chips. And if you have a document that contains nachos, that may come up in your search because the search intelligence is smart enough not just to look for the exact word you're looking for, but to also look for synonyms and keywords and really help you find the data within your vast of SharePoint library that you're trying to bring up or recall. And more, what we're seeing is bots being able to do that, where you could have a friendly bot where you say, hey, can you find me the customer proposal that we last did for this customer? And it's going to go access the SharePoint library, figure out what a proposal looks like, look at the version history, find the most recent one and say, hey, I think this is what you're looking for. Which allows you to quickly find what you need, even when you have very, very, very large libraries or many of them. And then SharePoint promotes structure over sprawl. So you don't have lots and lots of folders where you're going 1925 layers deep. You have files organized into a simpler system, but with really good search and AI capabilities to make it easier to find that data when you're looking for it. And it's more than just a file system. Dropbox is a folder where SharePoint is a digital headquarters. You've got an intranet and comms hub, you have department-specific content hubs, and you can have an embedded dashboards, news feeds, and Teams integrations all built into the system. And then it's cost-effective. Why pay for Dropbox and Microsoft 365 when SharePoint does more for less? Many of you already have it included in your licensing, which means you don't have an additional subscription to buy. It reduces software sprawl and consolidates platforms and just makes management so much easier. But where we really want to spend some time is on the AI and automation ready capabilities of SharePoint. So first we'll look at Power Automate. Automate approvals, notifications, document routing, task assignments, all right from the SharePoint library. You can trigger flows based on when a file is uploaded, whether a status has been changed, or metadata fields. Metadata fields will be like last accessed by or the original author. All of the data about the data can also trigger automations and flows and be captured. And then you can use built-in templates that Microsoft has already created for businesses that are doing common practices, or you can build your own custom automations in just minutes. Then you start integrating AI-powered Copilot. Microsoft 365 can read, summarize, and extract insights from your SharePoint files. It can generate reports, recap meetings, or draft content based on documents stored in SharePoint. And you're going to be able to ask natural language questions across your SharePoint libraries. So, like I was mentioning for earlier, when was the last time we did a proposal for X client? And have it be able to do that search for you rather than you having to navigate the file system, find the file, look at the modified date, and do that on your own. You also get the benefit of the Power Platform synergies that come across the different Microsoft tools. You can combine SharePoint with Power Apps to build internal tools with drag and drop simplicity, or build little internal apps for your employees to use without having to hire expensive developers. You could build things like a vacation request portal, or an asset tracker, or onboarding checklist, all without ever having to write a single line of code. And you can use Power Virtual Agents to build chatbots that pull directly from the SharePoint lists and libraries. And then you also get these AI enhanced search engine and insights. So AI driven search services, the most relevant content, not just the file names. It's going to have smart suggestions to help users find related documents, people, or data across all the different platforms, Teams, Outlook, and SharePoint. And when you combine that metadata with the AI, you start to take your knowledge to the next level. The more organized your SharePoint library is, the smarter your AI becomes. The smarter your AI is, the more you can leverage AI to be competitive in your market. All right, so now let's get to the theme of today's webinar, which is myth busting some of the SharePoint myths that we have seen out there. We'll start with SharePoint is just a glorified file server. So hopefully by now I've proven to you it's not. SharePoint is a full collaboration and workflow platform. It supports custom apps, automation, dynamic content management, and it goes way beyond just traditional file storage. The second is it's impossible to use unless you're an IT expert. While this was true for many years, modern SharePoint is designed for non-technical users. With intuitive interfaces, templates, and drag and drop site creation, anyone can use it with very minimal training. Next up, everything gets lost in SharePoint. Again, this also was true for a long time, but now it's usually a configuration issue, not a platform issue. When structured correctly, SharePoint search, tagging, and versioning are best in class. It becomes very, very easy, very quick to find any file you're looking for, regardless of what the file's named, whether you can remember where it's named, where you put it. Just using the built-in AI search tool within Teams, you can type in a few keywords about the file you're looking for and have it automatically give you a list right there, almost like a Google search result. It's outdated and clunky. That's again one of those persistent myths that has stuck around. That was based on the old school version of on-premise SharePoint. The cloud-based SharePoint Online has a fresh UI, a very modern user interface, and continuous improvements. It's updated constantly. You can't collaborate in real time. This is one that today we still hear people tell us. SharePoint not only supports real-time authoring in Word, Excel, and PowerPoint natively in the browser, you can also do this with a desktop app and with the other apps, and you can do it across Teams, OneDrive, or the SharePoint interface. It's only for large enterprises. SharePoint is scalable. In fact, where we see some of the best adoption is on the small and medium-sized businesses. Organizations that have started to tip maybe that 15 or 20 or 25 employee count, and they're starting to scale. And they need things to be simple, to be scalable, to be easy to find, to be easy to train and onboard new employees. They need to be able to restrict security and compliance. And SharePoint is a really, really good tool for those kind of businesses that are just crossing over from that startup phase into a more scalable business. It's hard to manage permissions, not if you use Microsoft 365 groups. So think of a group as any organization of people in your business that are going to share permissions. So a sales team, a marketing team, an engineering team. You create those groups, you decide who's in those groups, you can self-manage them. So if I was to make you the owner of a group, you can just click on the group, hit add member, type in an employee's name, hit add, and now that person's in your group. Now, if you don't want that person to access your files anymore, you just simply hit remove member, click their name and delete, and now they don't have access to that. And you're doing all of that right from the Microsoft Teams interface is the easiest way to do that. And now an employee, a manager, a director, anybody in your company who's in charge of a team of people can control who has access to what documents without having to involve IT or try to keep track of complex systems of permissions. We tried it once and it didn't work. This is probably one of the most challenging things to get over. Once people have that initial bad impression of SharePoint, it can be hard to get them to give it a second chance, but it's really, really important. It either is you were using a very old version of SharePoint a long time ago, or you did the migration wrong. And in just a minute, we're going to look at some of the challenges we see with migrations and why they can go awry that can cause that negative perception. So let's jump into that. Let's talk about why SharePoint migrations do fail and what you can do to avoid them. So the first is people who try the lift and shift file dumping method. This is where you treat SharePoint like a shared drive and just dump everything into it. This is the thing that we see most often. We'll see an IT company, especially a smaller IT company, telling a customer, we're going to move your data to SharePoint. They just kind of take all the data, grab it, and dump it into SharePoint and leave it there. That doesn't work. They're not the same. As we have just talked a lot about, your old file system was just a file system. It was just a place to store data. SharePoint is this very robust platform that allows you to do all kinds of stuff. You can't just take the engine out of one and dump it into the other and expect it to work the same way. There is some planning and structure that needs to go into this, and otherwise you're going to end up with the same clutter. Now it's just in the cloud. It makes it hard to secure, hard to search. It doesn't actually solve any problems. This also leads to a lot of syncing issues and a lot of kind of user complaints about the tool. The next is no clear governance or ownership. If you don't define the rules around structure, permissions, and content lifecycle, what you end up with is just chaos. People create sites and libraries like rabbits, and no one knows what's official or outdated. You have to have a governance structure. You have to decide who's allowed to make a new team, who's allowed to set up data in certain locations, who controls permissions. You got to build a little bit of an org chart for your SharePoint library so you know who owns what and who's in charge of what, and that way you control the chaos. The next is organizations who skip the planning phase. They just jumped in without first identifying the need, the use case, or the user personas. They didn't map all that out. If you don't get that right, you're going to build the wrong thing for the wrong people, and you're not going to have a very successful go live. We also see people who overcomplicate the setup. We've talked a lot about undercomplicating it. Overcomplicating it is when people want to build 25 different SharePoint libraries for a 20-person company, and they want to have all these complex systems of how data is stored and tracked and managed. That really isn't necessary. For most organizations, you're going to have probably one team for every 5 to 15 employees. And if you go too much more than that, you may be going more complex than you need. Otherwise, it gets to be too hard to maintain and understand, and users avoid it because they don't understand it. Then you've got under communicating the rollout. If you assume users will just figure it out and we're not going to do a lot of training or internal marketing, it's going to fail. No one knows how to use it or why you're using it, so they keep emailing it or using Dropbox the old school way. If you really want to get users using SharePoint correctly, you need to build some champions and do some initial training. The next thing we see a lot is people ignoring the permission strategy. So if you have either an inconsistent or overly granular permission, it can cause lots of issues. For example, we will push back if a client says, within this team, these 8 people have access. But within this one folder within the team, I only want to have 3 people have access to it. That's in old school file sharing land. We used to do that all the time. In SharePoint Online, we would push back very strongly and say that's not actually the best way to do that. It makes a much, much more sense to say if you've got a smaller group of people, you can create either a private channel and put the data in that channel, or create a separate team for those 3 people and put the data there. But if what you can do is make sure that the data is consistent across everything in that team, and there's no granular permissions once you get into that team, you find that it gets so much simpler and easier to manage and keep track of. This will lead to less people working around the system or security gaps where files are accidentally accessed by somebody who should not have access to them. And then another common thing we see is a lack of integration with Teams and 365. If you're going to use this successfully, you want to make sure that you're deploying SharePoint not in isolation, but you want to connect it to tools like Teams and OneDrive and Outlook. If you really truly look at the ecosystem as a whole and make this the building block that you're building your 365 foundation on, you're going to have a much, much better adoption because people are going to understand how to get to data, when to get to it. It's going to be cleaner and simpler, and they're going to be able to see the benefit of all of those integrations. The next thing we see is not having internal champions or internal advocates. It's really important that you have a couple of SharePoint Sherpas, a couple of people who are really passionate and excited about this, who are going to help to lead that change. Otherwise, there's no one to drive the adoption within the organization, and simple day-to-day questions like, hey, where's that marketing folder, aren't able to be answered internally, and that starts to break down the adoption. Another thing we see is a failure to define success metrics. So no idea what success looks like. Let's just move it to SharePoint. What we really strongly recommend is build some KPIs or a definition of success. What would it look like to get this right so that we can work backwards from that and make sure at the end of the day that we do in fact get it right. And then finally is migrating the wrong data. If you're interested in this topic, we actually just did an entire blog article about this particular topic, but not all data is suitable to be hosted in SharePoint, especially very large files or files that are what we call multi-layered files. Think about things like CAD files, um, Adobe Photoshop files, maybe large videos that you're editing. Those are not actually well suited for SharePoint. And if you just try to take everything you've got and move it all to SharePoint, regardless of what kind of data it is, you're likely going to have a failure point. SharePoint is great for things like Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Adobe PDFs, other what we call flat file systems, meaning there's one file for the document. You open it up, you edit it, you save it, you close it, and it's not hundreds and hundreds of megabytes large. Those are files that are really, really, really well suited for SharePoint. And if you have data that is not that, there's other great tools that we can layer on. Some of them are within the Microsoft ecosystem and some of them outside the Microsoft ecosystem. But that way you're not trying to put data in SharePoint that doesn't belong, which is guaranteed to cause issues with your deployment and your adoption. So hopefully by now, a few of you are feeling a little bit more confident or optimistic about centralizing more and more of your data into the SharePoint platform. And you're starting to see some of the benefits, not only of not using on-prem file servers or NASs or SANs, but also of why it could be valuable to move your data off of Dropbox or Box or Google Drive or wherever else your data lives onto one single platform, in this case, Microsoft 365 SharePoint. If that's the case, you may be wondering, well, where do I go from here? I'm getting it. I agree. I'm bought in. How do I start this process? Well, of course, this is something that not only are we very passionate about, but we have a tremendous amount of experience in. We've done over 37 full migrations from file servers to the cloud, and we've done probably another 2 or 3 dozen that were off of other file system platforms like Dropbox, Box, or Google Drive. And we're really good at helping you not just get to the endpoint, but to build that plan, to think about your internal advocates, to come up with your governance structure, to build your file structure, to help you avoid some of those common pitfalls that can cause what would have otherwise been a successful migration to be a failed migration. So we're happy to be those Sherpas and to do the heavy lifting for you and to leverage our experience to make your process simpler and easier. And one of the ways that we offer that is just a flat SharePoint migration package. We can sometimes customize these on a case-by-case basis, but we also do offer just a flat plan that says we can, for $5,000 for up to 10 teams with included data, we can do all the things that you see on the screen here, where we're going to do the visioning session, we're going to build your landing page, we'll give you the architecture, we'll do 2 hours of data migration preparation, helping you organize old files, archive data, shrink file names, do the actual migration itself, build a phase migration plan, and then do some training for your end users to make sure it's successful. And again, if this isn't exactly what you need, we're always happy to customize something on a case-by-case basis for your organization that fits your particular needs. So we've got about 10 minutes left. I'd love to open it up for any questions. Feel free to post them in the chat or just unmute. Somebody's asking, how much does SharePoint cost? So It's a difficult question to answer because for a lot of people, the answer is going to be zero. If you have Microsoft 365 licensing today, if you look at the details of your plan, oftentimes it will say includes up to X terabytes of SharePoint data. What's nice about it is it's all pooled. So let's say you've got 5 users and they each have 1 terabyte of SharePoint data. It's not that each one of those people gets 1 terabyte. It's that collectively the company has 5 terabytes. And every time you add somebody, you're adding a terabyte of data. That means that as your company grows, your total available storage grows, and we have more data that we can put stuff on. Now, if you run out of data, we can always buy more data. So you can elect to just purchase additional SharePoint storage, or we can look at, can we archive some data onto other platforms, get data into something other like Microsoft Azure storage or Microsoft Blob storage, which is kind of a funny name. But there's other ways that we can help get that data file size down to just being the active data that you're using all the time. Somebody was asking about some tips and tricks to using SharePoint better. We are happy to schedule time to talk about your specific implementation and say, how do we take from where you are now and take it to the next level? How can we maybe start building some of those portals or some of those automation tools? How can we start to take some of the dashboarding capabilities, laying on things like Power BI to pull access or even AI to create chatbots to layer into that data? So that's certainly something that we can talk to you about on a case-by-case basis if that's something you're interested in. And also we can look at including that in a future webinar topic. In terms of cleaning up some data, kind of your best course of action is, again, probably to reach out and to say, hey, we've got a SharePoint implementation, but we think it's gotten a little stale, or we think that we're starting to hit some space limits. How do we start to manage the size of our SharePoint and look at maybe how we can use it a little bit better? Again, that's a great optimization project where we can come in, look at what you're doing today, kind of inventory, where is it working well, where is it struggling, kind of what are we seeing from a security, from a compliance standpoint, from the optimization standpoint. We can run reports about who's accessing what data when and where. We can see your total adoption rate. There's some really great metadata that we can access in your tenant that will help us really understand how well your SharePoint adoption is really going, whether everybody's using it or it's only 8 people, whether 20% of your staff uses it all the time and 80% only uses it once a month. We can see all that data on the back end and help you figure out, okay, where are you today? Where do you want to go? And how do we close that gap? It might be some additional training. It might be some reorganization or restructuring. So that's always something that we're happy to do. If you reach out, we can talk about that. Somebody's saying, what if you have the wrong SharePoint implementation? So the good news is they're not that hard to fix. If you've got an implementation that maybe wasn't done quite right, maybe it was done a little bit too early or done incorrectly, and you just don't have the right structure based on the way it should be set up, there's always an opportunity to say, where are we today? Where would we like to be? What's that gap? And then build a migration plan to get you there. Sometimes we can just kind of retool what's already there. And sometimes we just build a new system and migrate the data from the old system to the new system. And that can be done fairly seamlessly without a lot of interruption to your staff. So that's another very common project that we get called into, is to fix broken SharePoint implementations. Probably the one that we see most often is we get customers to say, we moved to SharePoint, but now we constantly are having file sync errors where this thing pops up and it says, we couldn't sync your data, or I'm editing the version, but when Tony opens it, he doesn't see my edits. And now we have 2 different versions of the same document. Those are all botched implementations. And they usually come from that kind of dump methodology where we just took all the data from somewhere and dumped it into SharePoint and just synced everything. While that file sync works really well, and it's a great way to have access to data you're using all the time, if you try to sync 300,000 files to every single one of your employees' computers, it's going to have all kinds of issues. That's not how SharePoint was designed, but we see a lot of people that's what their SharePoint implementation looked like. So what we need to do is go back and say, okay, just ignore that data for a second. Let's build out the right structure and system that does make sense, and let's migrate the data from this kind of centralized location to the right places, and then train users on how to sync the data that they need access to without syncing everything. Any other questions?
Hey Delcy, this is Steph Lucier. Probably easier to ask than type, but can you talk about permissions a little bit more? I'm curious, you mentioned Microsoft 365 groups. Is that something users can create, or do you have to have admin access? Um, and then is that the only option of creating Microsoft groups outside of creating a Teams group?
It's a great
That makes
question.
sense.
Yeah,
Okay.
it does. And there's a lot of different ways you can do it. I'll show you maybe the easiest one. Um, so if I just show you a team here. So these are teams that we have in our company. Let's say that I wanted to make a new team that I was going to use just for a new project I'm working on. There's six of us that are going to work together. I could hit create new team. Now, that's a permission that you as the administrator are going to decide who has. Our strong recommendation is do not give that to everybody. If everybody can create teams, it gets out of control very quickly. That goes back to that governance system. But maybe department heads, maybe executive team members, there are people in the organization who should be able to create new teams. And whoever has that permission would make that team. Now, when they make the team, they're going to be able to answer some pretty simple questions. What do you want to call it? What's the description? And then what kind of team is this? Private means people would need to be invited to join. Public means anybody in your organization can join. And org wide means they automatically are joined the second you create it. You don't need to manually add them. So you'd pick the appropriate one. Let's say it's private. You would then just name who do you want to have access to it in the next screen. So if I just put test here, name my first channel test. Now, when I get here, I'm going to decide who do I want to have in that team. So I can just add members right here. I'm going to add my COO. So now I've added her. Now, if I go to that team, because it now exists, at any point in time, I can go to that new team and I can hit add member. And I could add anybody else to that team that I want to add. Now, if I add somebody as a member, they can see all the files, they can access it, they can collaborate with it. But if I add them as an owner, they also have the ability to add other people. So I could create one and then I could make the department head the owner. And then from that point forward, the department head can manage this team and add people, remove people, and kind of manage the access to it. There are other ways of doing what Steph asked, but this is probably the fastest and easiest way is using the Microsoft Teams interface to create teams. On the back end, when you do this, you are actually making what's called a Microsoft 365 group, but you don't need to know that or even worry about that. You can just create teams if you've been given permission to do so, and then manage and organize your data and files around those teams.
And I think I used to know the answer to this, but when you create a team within Teams, it's is it correct that it automatically creates a SharePoint site? And if so, is there a way to prevent that? I know the files, the folders, those are on the back end SharePoint, but I'm just curious, can you create a group Teams without having a SharePoint site?
So if you wanted to create a Microsoft 365 group, without creating a SharePoint site, then you would not create it through Teams. You could get use what's called the Microsoft 365 admin portal, and you could go in there and say, I want to make a group. That group could be for distribution email purposes. It could be for um, maybe accessing an app you're creating or some other permissions based thing. But if it's going to be about file permissions and accessing and collaborating on data, then you build it in Teams. It will make the SharePoint library, and then that's the SharePoint library that you're going to end up using for the data you want those people to collaborate on. So yes, you can make one that does not have a SharePoint library, but if you make it through Teams, it will automatically by default create an empty SharePoint library in the back end. The SharePoint library will have any data in it, but it will make it as a kind of a container.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. So we are just about out of time. If you do have additional questions, please do not hesitate to reach out. This is clearly a topic that we have a lot of passion and enthusiasm for, and we're happy to help people get the most out of their SharePoint migration, either one that they've already done or get them to SharePoint if they're not there yet. Before I close out, I just want to quickly plug our two upcoming webinars. On Wednesday, May 28th, we're going to look at how do you build AI bots yourself. So anybody in this call is capable of building an AI bot, and we're going to show you how to do that in a couple different ways. And then on June 25th, we're going to be partnering with Bank W Staffing to look at when do you hire, when do you outsource, and when do you build a bot? And as we start to think about our org charts and hiring and firing and expanding and changing and scaling, we're going to need to be thinking about this new category of when do I hire, when do I outsource, or when do I build an AI bot? And so those are our two upcoming webinars. We hope we'll see you at both of them. If not, they will be recorded and posted to our website along with this webinar from today. And I hope you guys have a great rest of your week. Thank you, everybody.